Yeah, good afternoon. The last few days, I've really enjoyed the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, and I trust that you too have been blessed. The Christians there were very poor, but they were just so genuine and so generous, so much glowing in their faith, yeah, that it gave Paul great joy and comfort, just remembering them when he was in prison. Isn't it lovely to know people like that? Well, today we return to the book of Acts in our BWJ reading, Being with Jesus. I'm afraid it's going to be a stark contrast as Paul is confronted with a totally different group, or rather groups of people, the high and mighty and the vicious. So yeah, we're back to Acts chapter 25. It will be the entire chapter. And it's primarily set in the city of Caesarea. Caesarea is also known as Caesarea Maritima or Caesarea by the sea. This is not to be confused with Caesarea Philippi. Yeah? So, yeah, we recall last week's reading when Paul returned from his third missionary journey. He landed in this port city, this very port city, and stayed several days with Philip the evangelist, and then he also met the prophet, yeah, Agabus. Okay, so it was this port city we'll be basing our reading on today. This is where everything will be happening today, mostly. So yes, so Caesarea, somewhere along the coast between the Sea of, not between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, but you could see it there, yeah. And then Jerusalem, right down there. If it's a straight line, crow's flight, it's roughly 80 over 90 kilometers. But as we know, roads are not, that straight. So in terms of traveling time, it'll be longer than that. Yeah. And those of you who have been blessed enough to go through the Holy Land trips and have you would have visited Caesarea, I'm sure, and you would have come away with impressions of the historical city that is now pretty much in ruins, yeah, as we will see in the next photo. So ruins of just, the odd column here and there and bits like this. So sometimes it's pretty hard to imagine what it used to be like, yeah. But then thankfully we have technology and modern discoveries, archaeological discoveries and all sorts. So now we can see the reconstructed version of what Caesarea used to be 2,000 years ago. Just going to show you another picture. And you can see that this is not a backwater little fishing village kind of, sleepy seaside town. Look at that. Look at the like I said, it's reconstructed. It's pretty well done. So apparently some of the structures are still there, and when you go to the Holy Land, you will see them. So just take a look at the top picture. You see the semicircular sort of building. That is the theater. But the one that we want to focus on is the little bit that's jutting out to the sea. Okay, that's kind of a squarish part that's jutting out to the sea. Now that is the, yeah, thank you, yes, that is where Herod the Great built his palace. Wow, fantastic seaside scenery, three ways, yeah. And then further back, right at the far end, along the coast, you will see some structures there, and that is the harbor. So Caesarea is actually not a natural harbor, but we know that when Herod the Great built it, this was an amazing piece of architecture because, or engineering, because he actually built the two sea walls, and you can see little bits of it jutting out. The sea walls to enable a calmer harbor and ships can sail in. Okay, so that's what it looks like. No, thank you very much. the next thing we want to do, so this is the Caesarea we're talking about, is that I actually found a very good video. It would be nice if in your free time you take a look at it. It's a 20-minute video, but today I've just tried to condense it to 5-minute clip, and it's to focus our mind and on the various buildings and structures that Paul could have possibly passed through, walked past, and maybe even preached in, okay? So we're going to take a very short journey back in time to this place called Caesarea, a port city built by Herod the Great, and try and capture a sense of the grandeur and significance of the place, because actually in part of our reading today, Paul has a royal audience in this very place.
With its large, protected port, the city became the gateway to the Middle East, sometimes being called the eastern capital of the empire.
Well, you know, the first century historian Josephus wrote that Herod built that harbor in order to display, quote, the innate greatness of his character. And because in thrusting the massive breakwaters far out into the sea, the king displayed, he said, an ambition to conquer nature herself. But it wasn't just the harbor that Herod built. A city this large with all of the urban areas and the bathhouses and the fountains and the ritual baths and the temples and the public buildings, they all had to have a large supply of fresh water. So what he did was he built this massive Roman-style aqueduct, and he channeled water from the springs that were on the southern slope of a mountain some 8 miles away. Parts of that aqueduct, along with the adjacent one that was built by Hadrian 100 years later, can still be seen today. All of that water, it was essential for the people that were traveling through there and living there, but it was also essential for Herod's personal residence and for the buildings that he constructed for the arts and for entertainment, many of which were large and lavish. Wow, this really was a city of luxury.
Near the seawall and port, the city boasted a theater that held as many as 4,500 people. In recent years, the theater has been partially restored and is used for concerts and other performances even today. On the southern side of the seawall, Herod built an enormous palace for himself. The palace is called the Promontory Palace because it actually extends into the sea. The palace was an opulent testimony to Herod's wealth, power, and architectural accomplishments. Remarkably, the house contained stone swimming pools more than 120 feet long and 45 feet wide, almost at sea level. Although almost completely Roman, the palace even had a mikveh, a Jewish bath for ritual cleansing. After Herod's death, this palace became the headquarters and official residence of whatever governor or procurator Rome installed to oversee Judea. In fact, as recorded in Acts chapter 12, this is most likely the place where Herod Agrippa I was eaten by worms after accepting worship from the people of Tyre and Sidon.
There are several episodes recorded in the New Testament that take place at or connect to Caesarea Maritima. We know of the Pilate Stone. We know that Roman prefects like Pontius Pilate were stationed there. We know that Cornelius and associates were converted there. So this city, with its large harbor, it played a role in Paul's missionary journeys. And it was in Caesarea that Paul was held for just over 2 years by the procurators Felix and Festus. From there, he sailed to Rome for trial. The details of all of these biblical descriptions align exactly with what is known about this ancient city as confirmed by outside sources and archaeological investigations. So these are valuable confirmation that what we are told in the Bible is accurate and reliable.
When Paul was arrested and transferred to Caesarea, Paul was kept in Herod's praetorium, or official residence. Completing the complex with the palace and theater was a hippodrome for chariot races and other large spectacles involving men and animals.
The hippodrome, the theater, and the palace were sites for major cultural and sporting events. And the hippodrome, or as Josephus described it, the amphitheater, was about 300 meters long. It was 50.5 meters in width. Its stones that were used in its construction were cut from the fossilized sandstone in the area, and the stadium itself could hold about 10,000 spectators. In the center of that hippodrome, there was a series of subchambers and tunnels that were discovered. And then on the east side of the seating area, archaeologists discovered the remains of a podium where a lot of the dignitaries evidently sat. At its completion, there was this special series of games that were conducted, and they did that in honor of Caesar. And all of those games included things like chariot races and gladiatorial fights with wild animals. It was quite a spectacle. The design and the opulence of that particular hippodrome and all of the other complexes surrounding it, they were so remarkable. But to me, what is even more exciting is the connection between these places and the events that are revealed in Scripture.
Yeah, so I hope this gives us a better idea of the setting for our reading today. Yeah, so we read that Paul had now been in prison for almost 2 years, for about 2 years, and this is around the year AD 60. Okay, and I'm going to be reading from Acts NIV version, yeah, Acts chapter 25. It is actually a fairly straightforward narrative in 3 sections. And what I'll probably do is that I will pause at each of these 3 sections for a short reflection, okay? So let's now go into this historical event. In your Bibles, I think a lot of you will have some subtitles, and it says the trial before Festus, okay? I'll start with that in verse 1 to down to verse 12. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented charges against Paul. They urgently requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me and press charges against the man there if he has done anything wrong. And after spending 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before them. When Paul appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Then Paul made his defense. I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews, or of the temple, or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, then are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Paul answered, I'm now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I've done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. 12 verses here basically talks about, this is Paul's 4th defense that he made before the new governor, the Roman governor Festus in Caesarea. Favor. What is this favor? Now, these men, let's remember, they're the chief priests and the leaders of the Jewish community. They say basically to Festus, give us Paul who preaches the good news. We hate him and we want to kill him. Essentially, that is the favor. In their view, Paul was a heretic whose teachings on the resurrection of Jesus were contrary to Judaism. In fact, actually, Paul teaches that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. In this passage, we see how deep and how intense is the hatred and the malice of the Jewish leaders. They are determined as ever to carry out their plan to kill Paul, which they failed 2 years earlier. Remember, I think we read last week, when Paul was given the, I think his nephew, was went to Paul in jail, and so Paul requested for him to then go and tell the Roman governor, the Roman commander. So there was this immediate arrangement where Paul was escorted out of Jerusalem in the middle of the night, 9 o'clock it says, heavily guarded by Roman soldiers. And then the next day he arrived in Caesarea. Okay, so that was how he ended up in Caesarea. And 2 years have passed, and we have a new governor. So at this point, let's pause for a little thought here. What does this record of the opposition against Paul teaches us? Well, firstly, we must count the cost, as Jesus said. Paul constantly experienced this. We know that from his missionary journeys as well. Certainly, this is very true too of many places today, even now, where Christians are persecuted for their faith. In our BWJ reading today, right on the very last bit, we are reminded to pray for God's intervention and his protection for those who are persecuted in their time of need. So what about you and I? Maybe we are not so badly persecuted as in our lives are being threatened. It's not right now. But do you feel that you are being treated unfairly or unjustly? Sometimes you're under increasing pressure to compromise your beliefs and your values. What do we do in such times? Let us place hope in the perfect justice of God. Because it's in such time of waiting upon God to act that our hopes and our fears are often confronted and shamed. But then do we give in? Do we give up? Paul says in Philippians letter that we just read 2-3 days ago, I press on toward the goal that God has called me heavenward in Christ. So Paul is actually thinking about his citizenship, his heavenly citizenship. Let's also remember, the goal of Paul's defense isn't simply just for him to get himself off the hook. Of course, it would be nice to be a free man, right? His main concern was to defend his innocence for the sake of the gospel. He doesn't want the gospel to be falsely associated with some guy who's leading a political upheaval. So that's why in verse 8 he says, I have done nothing wrong. I have done nothing wrong against the Jews, or the temple, or against Caesar. As we have witnessed throughout Paul's ministry, the followers of Jesus don't spread his kingdom by political revolt. They do it through patient, truthful teaching and through love, even when this love means suffering for Christ's sake. Okay, that's my little reflection for this section. Let's continue to read on. The next section is from verse 13 to 22. And a few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. And he said, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought charges against him. and asked that he be condemned. And I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. So when they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up and to speak, they did not charge him with any crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. I was at loss how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision. And I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "Oh, I'd like to hear this man myself." He replied, "Tomorrow you will hear him." Okay, in this passage, we notice how Festus tries to paint himself in the best possible light and wanting to do the Jews a favor, just as Felix did, his predecessor. He knows that he can't release Paul or he'll upset the Jews very much. But then in verse 20, it says, he was at a loss how to investigate these questions. Actually, Felix knew deep down in his heart that there was nothing Paul committed that was deserving of, imprisonment. But then he says, "Oh, I don't know how to investigate these questions." Actually, the only loss he really is concerned about is his own reputation with the Jews, right? And now is also his reputation with Caesar, because Paul had appealed to Caesar, which means that Festus is forced to come up with some good reason why he's sending and why he's keeping Paul in custody. And then, if he sends him off to Rome without any proper write-up charges, then Festus will look bad. He'll become a laughing stock, as a governor. He can't even tell the boss, Caesar, why Paul is being sent, So that's his big worry. Well, I have a few points here for personal reflection as to what we can learn from Festus. The first thing is, do you find it hard to turn down a favor? Even if it means upsetting someone, and most likely it will mean upsetting someone. Have you ever been in a tight or a conflicting situation recently? Think about it. How do you react? Then another thing is, what about the need to constantly justify ourselves? Perhaps some of us have such tendencies without even realizing it. Perhaps we really need to be more attentive to the Holy Spirit's whispers, telling us, you need not have said that, or you need not have done that. Well, for some of us, are we carrying too much worries, burdens, and are they related to what you think others are thinking of you? As in, a lot of these governors, I suppose they have huge responsibilities. And I think sometimes we can often, relate to that, don't we, in our own situations too, what others think. Well, as people of the Lord, have you asked God what He thinks of those worries, what He thinks of the burdens, instead of carrying it yourself? This is something that I speak to myself too. Yeah? But now I'd like to move on to the next section, the last section, where Paul is brought before King Agrippa, okay, from verse 23 all the way to the last verse 27 in this chapter. And the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in, and Festus said, "King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man? Well, the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write. To His Majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. So here we are in this great city that King Herod the Great, the one who built the city of Caesarea 80 years ago, in all those grand buildings that you saw just now in the video. Well, this is a historical event. Amidst all the grandeur and magnificence of setting, Festus had made it publicly known again that Paul does not deserve to die. Okay, and so he is hoping that King Herod will help him solve his big problem. Okay, but then what about Paul? We'll think about Paul later. But now in this audience, Paul has Herod's great-grandson, Agrippa II, and his wife, or maybe okay, they call her Bernice. In some versions, it says Queen Bernice. Okay. Actually, these two VIPs share a very interesting family history. Actually, mind-boggling relationships. Okay, it was their grandfather's half-brother, the ruling Herod, 30 years ago, was also known as Antipas I or Herod the Tetrarch. It was this, I suppose you call him granduncle, right? Yes, who had beheaded John the Baptist. And then 3 years later, the same Herod met Jesus hours before Jesus was sentenced to die on the cross. The Gospel of Luke records this detail in Luke chapter 23, yeah, where Herod Antipas wanted Jesus to perform a miracle for his entertainment. He was visiting Jerusalem at that point. But Jesus would not answer him. Jesus did not comply. And so Herod and his soldiers mocked Jesus, gave him an arrogant robe to wear, and then sent him back to Pilate. So instead of freeing an innocent man, Herod sent him back to Pilate, who had the authority to have Jesus crucified, which we know he did. Yeah, he gave it to the crowd. So we see that Herod Antipas had a part in conspiring Jesus' death, just as his own father, Herod the Great, had wanted to track down and kill baby Jesus at his birth. Okay, so these were the forefathers, third and fourth generation. We now have Agrippa II and Bernice. Incidentally, they had an aunt, the father's sister, called Herodias, familiar name, the one who married both her uncles. First it was Philip, and then it was Antipas. So, yes, Bernice herself had also been married at a young age to her uncle. And it seems that she returned to her family and is now presented as Queen Bernice. Maybe some sort of a incestuous relationship with the brother as well. So yeah, this was the royal audience that Paul is brought out to face. Had he expected it? We don't. We don't. But he's been shuffled around all over the place before this people, that people, before this official, that official, before this governor and that, and now before a king. In all of these craziness that's going on, it's easy to forget that God's sovereign purpose, what his sovereign purpose is, especially for Paul after 2 years of imprisonment. But then let's not miss the Lord's sovereign purpose in all of this. Let's recall, at Paul's conversion, and I'm sure over the 2 years he has thought much about it too, in the book of Acts, chapter 9, verses 15 to 16. At his conversion, the Lord had spoken these words through Ananias. He says, go, for Paul is chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. So today we see Paul standing before King Herod. Herod Antipas II, Agrippa II. So I would, because of time, I would like to end with a simple point for reflection. We read again of Paul's trial. This is his fourth. Is it just another trial that we read about today? Or does the Holy Spirit want me, to see that Jesus is alive and he's enabling his people to walk in his footsteps? This is only possible if we truly depend on him to live that resurrected life. You know, this morning I woke up with this song. It's a long time ago we used to sing with the Sunday school children. Simple song, it says, God's not dead, he's alive. Oh, he's alive in me. You know that song? God's not dead, he's alive. God's not dead, he's alive. Oh, he's living in me. Oh, he's alive in me. Okay. It's nice to sing these songs, but we need to settle it in our own hearts. In fact, I had to ask myself, what do I really live for? Do I live to seek, to see and recognize more and more of God's sovereign purpose in my life? Or am I easily distracted by other issues? You know, Paul says, again, in the Philippian letters that we have read recently, that he says, I want to know Christ. I want to know the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. Yeah. Paul knows that that is what matters most, to know Christ and to be in fellowship with Christ, to live the resurrected life. So remember that picture earlier we saw of Caesarea, which is now in ruins? That is a picture of what happens to the kingdoms of the world. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, but the word of the Lord stands firm forever. Well, I pray that all of us, may you be blessed more and more by his living word in your life.